Good morning, everyone. Welcome to McDowell Methodist Church. Here at McDowell, we're committed to our mission, which is to connect others to Christ. If you are new or visiting with us this morning, allow me to extend a word of welcome and affirmation. Certainly glad you're joining us for worship. We hope that the service is both meaningful and relevant. In the summer of 2009, I hired myself out as a camp counselor at East Bay Camp, north of Bloomington. It was one of those hot and sticky Illinois summers, the kind where if you were to step outside, you would be immediately immersed in your own sweat. The humidity was oppressive, turning even the most mundane activity, such as a quick hike through the woods or a short trot to the dining hall, into an astronomical challenge. Most days, any physical activities had to be organized around whether or not our pale and young campers would be safe doing those activities in the heat of the noonday sun. 9 times out of 10, the answer was no. We couldn't play soccer in the afternoon because the risk of heat stroke was too high. No, we couldn't swim at the lake because the concentration of algae was elevated to unhealthy levels. The pool was out of the question because the chlorine pump had failed. And the boats still hadn't been repaired from the damage rendered to them by campers from the previous year. As such, many of our carefully planned activities frequently went the way of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. In one form or another, they wound up in the toilet. Abandoned plans thus became a common motif that defined our collective experience that summer, the result of Murphy's Law rearing its unwelcome head into our carefully concocted designs. But it was one particular change of plans that summer which would throw me end over end directly into the heart of the lion's den. It just so happened that in the summer of 2009, my boss, the camp program director, had arranged for a praise band to lead the nightly worship service at camp that summer. It also just so happened that this same praise band would never show up to do their job. But the campers were expecting a praise band. It was in the brochure, after all. They craved it, they needed it, they demanded it. And so did my boss. But in the absence of a praise band, a camp counselor with any measure of musical skill, no matter how small, would do in a pinch. And who should be the unlucky counselor appointed for the task of providing music to the sugar-induced masses of hyperactive mutant children? It was the one who was stupid enough to bring a bass guitar with him to camp. Never mind that he had never once performed in front of an audience. Never mind that he had never once taken a lesson in how to use the instrument. I was a city duck. Seeing that she could have her cake and eat it too, my boss looked me square in the eye and uttered 4 words that would seal my fate. You're on at 5. Now, to an outside observer, this interaction would have appeared fairly benign. After all, how much power could 4 words really hold over one person? It's not as though I was completely powerless. I was an adult, after all. I could have said no. I could have asked for more time. I could have explained that I wasn't prepared for such a task. I could have sat there muttering like an idiot. I could have said or done any of these things. But I didn't. But Jeremiah sure did. Jeremiah said all of these things when God placed a call upon his heart. When God told Jeremiah that his time had come, that he had been appointed to be God's prophet to the nations, Jeremiah didn't just accept his fate with open arms. Jeremiah did what I was too stupid and too naive to do. he immediately began making excuses. He was too young and inexperienced. He didn't have the right gifts, the right qualifications. He didn't have the appropriate training. Still, God persisted. God didn't let Jeremiah run away just because he was afraid. For the stage was empty, and God was calling Jeremiah to come out of his comfort zone and step into the spotlight. But to what kind of stage was Jeremiah being called? Was it a stage with bright lights and a golden pulpit? Was it the kind of stage where a congregation of thousands would ooh and ah and fawn over his every word with bated breath? If that were the case, then there would have been people lining up for the job. But God wasn't calling Jeremiah to be a celebrity preacher any more than my boss was calling me to become the next Eric Clapton or Jimi Hendrix. For Jeremiah, answering God's call would lead him down a path that would ultimately seal his fate as a hated and scorned enemy of the state. But Jeremiah couldn't know what his future would hold, and neither can we. When God tells us we're on at 5, we aren't given guarantees, only an opportunity. Now, the challenge posed by this sermon is that it makes the critical assumption that I'm preaching first and foremost to a people who are called by God. That's number 1. And 2, to people who are willing to answer that call. And the question that we need to wrestle with today has less to do with whether or not we are called, because as a Wesleyan people, we believe that our calling begins in our baptism. Rather, we need to wrestle with the real reason why we haven't answered when God tells us, "You're on at 5." Like Jeremiah, we're used to finding justification for why we can't or won't accept the call that God has placed upon our hearts. You see, even with 3,000 years between us, Jeremiah makes all the same excuses we still make today. We're not equipped. We're too young, or in many of our cases, we're too old. We don't have any natural talent. We're uncomfortable with this. We have arthritis. We have surgery scheduled that day. We're too tired. We're too worn out, and we haven't cleared this with Medicare. But you know, when we read between the lines, we see that when God responds to Jeremiah, God doesn't address Jeremiah's excuses. God doesn't care about Jeremiah's comfort level. Rather, God speaks exactly 4 words to Jeremiah. 4 words that will change his life. Do not be afraid. Like Jeremiah, we have an arsenal of excuses for why we shouldn't answer the call, for why we couldn't answer the call, and we always will. But God knows that our excuses are really just a mask for our fears. And God doesn't speak to masks. God speaks to people. God speaks to the fearful child behind the mask. And God says to that child, "Do not be afraid." And the reason God speaks to our fears is because God doesn't just see us for who we are. The Almighty sees us for who we could become. God speaks to our fear because our fear is the only thing standing between the people we are and the people we could become. People whose words and actions are so anointed by the Spirit of God that nations are plucked up and planted, shaped and transformed at the sound of our voice. But we in the church don't see that side of ourselves, because we've been wearing a mask of fear for too long. Every time we look in the mirror, we see the face of fear staring right back at us. And before long, we begin to define ourselves by our fears rather than by the image of God in which we were created. We become attached to our successes and our failures, and we let them tell us who we are and what we're worth. But you know, God isn't fooled. Our Creator knows exactly what we're made of. And that's why the only 4 words more powerful than "you're on at 5" are "do not be afraid." "You're on at 5" are the words we claim in our baptism. They are the words of a hopeful child that is unafraid to dream. They're the words of a 19-year-old camp counselor with a bass guitar and literally nothing more. They're the words of a little church with a big heart. And they can be the words of teachers, nurses, and farmers. As long as we're willing to stand in the spotlight when God calls us. But as powerful as these words are, even the most hope-filled children become frightened sometimes. Frightened by an unknown future. Frightened by transitions they cannot control. Frightened because their community is changing around them. And so we in the church do what all children do when we're frightened. We run away. We retreat. We hide behind a mask. We make excuses. And so the stage remains empty, and the call goes unfulfilled. But God never gives up. Even when our own perception is only skin deep, God continues to look beyond the masks and the excuses and sees the sanctified child underneath. And when we finally remove our last mask, God looks us in the face and tells us, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid, child." And so, McDowell, if you're willing to toss your masks aside, God is willing to go the next step with you. I can't promise you that the process will be easy. I can't promise you that the process will be painless. I can't promise you that the process won't be scary sometimes. I can't even promise that I will be there to walk that path with you. But as someone who has been called to that stage many times before, I can promise you that it is a sanctifying journey. And because God is with you, you need not be afraid. God liberates us from our fears to become sanctified creations. You're on at 5. 4 words that can change your life. But only if you're willing to step on stage. Maybe you're being called today to serve the church in a new way. Maybe you're being called to start a new ministry. Maybe you're being called to lead the church into a new chapter. Maybe you're being called to go deeper in your faith. And maybe, just maybe, you're on at 5. Praise be to God. Amen.